Back to the heat. We're discussing U.S.-China relations on the heels of an important trade meeting in Chicago. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, trade between the two countries totaled more than $600 billion last year. Joining us now from Beijing is Xi Sitao. He's the chief economist with Deloitte China, a professional services firm. With us from New York is Robert Hormats. He's the vice chairman of Kissinger Associates, a New York City-based international consulting firm, and he also served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment from 2009 to 2013. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Xi Sitao, let me start with you. As I just mentioned, we had this 25th session of the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, the JCCT as it's known. That meeting took place in Chicago. That organization was established in 1983. Looking at the big picture, the broad picture here, how has the trade relationship between the United States and China evolved over the past 30 years?
I would say very well. I mean, really, the bilateral relationship started from very low base. Now it's the most important one among all countries. And I think the trend is still very positive. Economically, these two countries are very, very complementary. Not only China is the second largest economy, in addition to that, as a relatively, developing country, China is also the largest exporter of savings. So the relationship is just extremely complementary.
Robert, the United States and China are currently involved in negotiations to widen their economic and trade relationship. They're negotiating what's been called the Bilateral Investment Treaty, the BIT. It's been called a potential game changer. How significant is that treaty in expanding this relationship?
Well, it's very significant. It really is the next step in advancing closer ties between the United States and China on the economic front. China increasingly wants to encourage its companies to invest around the world, and large-scale Chinese investment is taking place in the United States and elsewhere. And of course, there has been for some time a very large amount of American investment in China. This would create a framework of rules and responsibilities on both sides to expand investment and improve the climate for investment in both countries. So I think it would create jobs in China, in high-end production, which China wants because wages are going up, and it would create investment opportunities in the United States, which helps us because we're obviously aiming at creating more jobs and higher quality jobs. Chinese companies would bring those, so it's win-win.
Xi Sitao, what are the main opportunities and also the challenges that face these two countries as they try to widen this relationship?
Challenges, I think, well, it's not easy to be number two. I mean, at some point, Chinese economy will surpass the U.S. economy, but even by then, based on per capita GDP, it's still going to be significantly lower than that of U.S. So I think this is changing the relationship because for a very, very long time, China has been benefiting from globalization, but increasingly China has to take more responsibilities. So I think expectations will be changed for both countries. I think that's creating certain challenges.
Robert, we just talked a moment ago about the Bilateral Investment Treaty. What will that do for American companies?
Well, I think it will help American companies to feel more comfortable in China, in particular if the so-called negative list is reduced substantially, which means that there are fewer areas that are off limits for American companies, giving more scope for American investment. I think it's also important that the question of the protection of intellectual property and business confidential information be worked out between the United States and China. A lot of the very high-end American investment that many American companies would like to put in China is inhibited by their concerns about intellectual property protection, for instance. So I think there are a number of issues that have to be addressed, and also to improve the environment so that American companies feel they're competing on a level playing field with Chinese state enterprises or state-supported enterprises. On the American side, I think it's important that Chinese companies feel very comfortable that there's an open, transparent process. And the treaty itself is important because it provides signals for American states and cities, because a lot of what goes on with respect to Chinese investment in the U.S. is not vis-a-vis the federal government. It's working with governors and mayors because they're very anxious to get more investment. So while it doesn't directly talk about that, it creates a good political environment for more interaction between Chinese companies and mayors and governors, and I think that's altogether positive.
Xi Sitao, China is strengthening market regulations, also stepping up its anti-monopoly investigations. Some U.S. businesses have expressed concern over that, over the tighter investment environment. Is that a valid concern on the part of American companies, do you think?
I think at this point, not just American companies being affected, many multinationals, they clearly feel somewhat perplexed. I think some of these concerns are valid because anti-monopoly is a relatively new area in China. The Chinese economy is under transition from a transition economy to a market economy. So arguably in certain area, state-owned enterprises are very dominant. But I do believe, as what Robert said, if the negative list is getting shorter, if ultimately market forces are playing decisive role, as what the new government has committed, I think some of these concerns will be mitigated.
Robert, what kind of support is there politically in the United States for these treaties, for expanding the relationship? I'm talking particularly about support in Congress.
Well, it's a very good point. A number of trade associations, the Chamber of Commerce and various other groups, have just written a letter to Vice Premier Wang Yang telling him very clearly that there is very strong support in the business community, and the business community will urge support in the Senate for this treaty if a good bilateral investment treaty can be worked out with good rules and a short negative list. So I think in the final analysis, if it's a good treaty and it has the right kinds of things in it, it will get the kind of support it requires in the Congress. I think it is also important to make sure that when this happens, it's not just something that's legally written down in a treaty, but that both sides have a greater degree of consultation and cooperation to make sure it works. And that means addressing some of the issues, making sure, for instance, that in the anti-monopoly investigations that are going on in China, and we believe in anti-monopoly policy here, it's a very important part of American policy.
Xi Sitao, when we look at multinational forums right now, there seem to be competing free market models being promoted by each side. I mean, we have the United States with its TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China is not a part of that. China is promoting the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. That's being championed in Beijing. So can the US and China work together to promote these free trade agreements?
The short answer is yes. I mean, China, actually China's stance towards TPP has become a lot more receptive over the years. I think China understands no matter what kind of trade framework you are in, without the United States, I mean, it's different. But at the same time, as China is becoming stronger, inevitably, there is a tendency for China may want to start a new kitchen, as the Chinese saying goes. So, so certain initiatives being unveiled by China, perhaps actually quite inclusive. At the same time, we have seen some tremendous changes in regional trade. To give you one example, if you take country Korea, South Korea is selling more product to China than was South Korea selling to United States and Japan put together. So, so I think China also has more options at this point. But the bottom line is, I think China and the United States can work together, and I do believe China's stance towards TPP is becoming a lot more receptive.
Robert, do you agree that these competing free market models are not going to pose a major obstacle to expanding the relationship?
I very much agree. I think that is exactly right, that China originally was very negative toward TPP, but very recently, in fact, even over a year ago, the Premier has made very positive statements. Premier Li has made very positive statements about it, and the United States is consulting with China as it develops its TPP process, and the negotiations, as you know, are still underway. And China's view of the free trade area of Asia, the Pacific, has a number of positive elements in it. And I think over a period of time, one thing that can happen is to take the best, the highest standards in both of those agreements and perhaps begin to put them together so that while they will not be integrated totally, some of the countries in the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific will be also in the TPP. So there is a sort of a growing emergence of cooperation, and they will be closer together. They may not join themselves, but there'll be a lot of synergies and interactions between the two. And I think it's also true in other areas. President Xi Jinping has talked about a new Silk Road and greater integration in the Asian region. The United States had talked about a new Silk Road, primarily focused on Central Asia, but also obviously would involve China because, of course, China was the key destination of the old Silk Road. So this whole question of infrastructure integration in the region that President Xi's been talking about, part of his vision, is something I think China and the United States should work together on as well, because we both have interests, trading interests and commercial interests in this entire region. China from East Asia over to the Red Sea. The United States has interests there too. We should cooperate, and if we don't cooperate, it'll be disruptive to both sides.
Okay, gentlemen, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for joining us.